it's 1517, and the Ottomans have control of Palestine. So, Jamie Allenson.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. Before we start, I think there are probably a couple of things worth picking up. The first is it might seem odd to have two white men discussing the history of Palestine without any Palestinians on the panel. Oh, that's true, yeah. I know that Palestinians were asked, but Palestinians are reluctant perhaps to take the stage at the moment. Partly they've got better things to do because of what's happening to their families and communities, as well as being afraid. So I know that free speech and academic freedom is one of the concerns of the organizers. There's a massive attack at the moment on free speech in general and academic freedom in particular to do with this issue. And it's directed one way. It's directed against the supporters of the Palestinian cause, and it is directed against those within academia who question an established narrative about the origins of the State of Israel. So there have been hundreds, literally hundreds of cases of people being disciplined, subject to vexatious complaint, other forms of kind of disciplinary procedure in universities in this country, up to and including being arrested, and the police coming onto this campus to go into student meetings. So there's a real threat going on, and it's only going one way. So it's not surprising that you might find a certain imbalance in the panel. I think it's also important to remember, so there are two, I think, ways that people conceive of this conflict that are basically wrong. One is that there is a kind of state called Palestine. There's a country, Palestine. Palestine's fighting Israel. And why is Palestine always fighting Israel? Like Russia and Ukraine, for example. That is not the case. So there are the Palestinians. There is no sovereign Palestinian state because the state or the society that occupied Palestine, which I'll speak about until 1948, was destroyed in 1948 to make way for the State of Israel, expelling the Palestinians into where they now live, leaving about half of them, the rest of them ending up in places like Gaza. That's why Gaza has 2 million people in it. They lived in what is now Israel. They are the indigenous inhabitants of that place. So that's the first point. The second point, which is very commonly assumed or is very current in kind of political responses to the present crisis, is to see this in some way, and here we have to be a bit careful with the timeline, I think, to see this in some way as a conflict between two global religious entities, Muslims and Jews, and that therefore something that you say about this conflict or this situation is in some way either an attack on Muslims or Jewish communities in this country, that somehow the Palestinians and Israel are representatives of two religious traditions that have always been in conflict, and that this is an age-old kind of war. That is untrue. It is not age-old, it's about 100 years old, and it is not religious. It's not about religious ideas. It's about the settlement of this particular land, Palestine, by a movement of people from Europe who were Jews, but not representative necessarily of the majority of the Jewish population in the world at that time. So those are two things to bear in mind. We also heard about the expulsion or the kind of the Second Temple. Now, there was a Second Temple. There was a kingdom of Judah. It was a Jewish kingdom. The kingdom of Israel, which was a separate thing, had actually ceased to exist about 500 years previously. That was the northern kingdom, if you remember your Bible studies. We don't actually know that there was a first temple. So the Second Temple is possibly a misnomer. And we also can't be sure that the people who are expelled from what became the Roman province of Palestine in 70 AD ended up becoming the Jewish diaspora. So those things are separate. It's generally the opinion, I'm no expert on this, but most ancient historians are generally of the opinion that the religious and cultural elite of the kingdom of Judea was expelled or sent into exile, but the vast majority of people remained and ended up becoming Muslims, Christians, maybe some of them remained Jews, but just like all the other areas of this part of the world, basically religion changed. So it's important to understand that. Now that doesn't mean that there's no legitimacy to the place that this land has in the kind of Jewish religious and cultural tradition, but it is a religious and cultural tradition rather than necessarily one of a kind of fact of descent, which is important because I think what we learn from some of the history we'll talk about, and definitely the history of the 20th century, is that the idea of politics and national identity and states based upon ethnic descent is a bad one. And it's generally at the root of most of these problems. So to come on to where we are here, under the Ottoman Empire, there wasn't a particular area called Palestine. So it's part of other administrative units connected either to Beirut or Damascus in the north, a separate area around Jerusalem in the middle, and then more to do with the Hijaz, so the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula in the south. There's no separate unit that we would call Palestine. Although the term was used in a loose sense, but people often also refer to this area as Syria, and the inhabitants of the area would probably just have referred to it as Bilad ash-Sham, or what we call the Levant, so that part of the Eastern Mediterranean. Under the Ottomans, it was a fairly kind of tolerant society in a sense. So not in our sense, not the way that we think everybody has individual equal rights to freedom of religion and so on. But different religious communities basically ran their own affairs with a kind of ruling Sunni Muslim elite. So they were undoubtedly in charge, but basically most of the society ran fairly autonomously. And that included in this area, Greater Syria, let's say, yes, communities of Muslims, but also very large communities of Christians, and a fair number of Jews. So there were Jewish communities in this area. The idea that we'll perhaps hear about from John, this was a land without people, so uninhabited, is completely untrue. Not only was it not a land without people, it wasn't even a land without Jewish people. It had an indigenous Jewish community in it, who were not generally subject to the kind of Judeophobia and anti-Semitism that happened in Christian Europe. So in the Islamic empires generally, and the Ottoman Empire particularly, there were outbursts of kind of attacks on religious minorities, Christians, Jews, Shia, non-Sunni Muslims. It happened from time to time. But this whole ideology of there being some kind of race of people who need to be controlled or exterminated or some particular threat, that's a completely European thing. It's not present even in the most kind of, let's say, most conservative forms of Islamic and Arab discourse in the 19th century. It appears later. Begins to appear with some events, probably not with the peasant revolt. So basically, Muhammad Ali, who was the leader of Egypt in the 1830s, took what is now Palestine from the Ottoman Empire's control. And that began to, because Muhammad Ali was trying to create state structures like European ones, began to show those ideas in Palestine. So that's why it's important, because people began to get these kind of ideas. Against Muhammad Ali's troops, there was a peasant revolt in which lots of people were killed, including a lot of people in Safed, which is a predominantly Jewish town, but probably just because they were in a town. There were lots of other towns that were subject to this. But there was a particular incident in Damascus which came to attract, it's important, because it came to attract the interest of Christians in Europe, particularly in this country and in Scotland, about a blood libel, so the kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory against the Jews that they're using the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes, which is a completely European thing, does not appear in the Middle East until this point. And it was actually fostered by Italian Catholic priests amongst the Christians of Damascus in order to offer a kind of a strategic entry point. But that led to a discussion about what do we do about the Jews of the Middle East in this country, and therefore in general about the idea of what they called restoring the Jews to the Holy Land, which is the origin really of the idea of Zionism. It's Christian, basically. It's kind of Christian idea of restoration. Of course, we're going through a lot of time periods here, but in this time, the Ottoman Empire was trying to introduce reforms which would increase a kind of more capitalist economy. So increase tax revenues by giving people individual private landholding, which meant that you got big landowners who were the people who eventually could sell the Palestinians' land to settlers, and to try and create modern state structures. And this was going on in Palestine as much as anywhere else. As a result, the population increased, 500, 700,000 perhaps at the end of the 19th century. It became quite prosperous in many ways. They were exporting fruit and textiles across the Mediterranean from ports like Gaza, Haifa, Acre, Jaffa, and developing kind of cultural institutions, newspapers, various associations and so on. So the point is there was a society there. It was not without people. It was not just a desert. It's very much an Eastern Mediterranean culture, society that existed. Now, the reason that that came not to exist, we'll hear a bit about the actual settlement enterprise, I think, in a bit from John, was the Ottomans entered the First World War on the side of the Central Powers, so the Germans, and they lost. Britain, which didn't really care that much about this area, but wanted, of course, to defeat a German ally, took Palestine, or defeated the Ottomans in 1917, coming up from Egypt through Gaza to Jerusalem. From that point on, it was under military rule of the British in the first instance, and then it came to be under mandate rule, which we'll go on to the next part. But the important thing is, Britain knew this was going to happen. They could get that the Ottoman Empire was going to collapse in this area, and so started making plans for the future. But they were completely different and contradictory plans for different people. So the first one is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So you might have heard of this. This was an agreement between the British and French foreign ministers in 1916. We know about it because after the Russian Revolution, it was secret. It was made open. It was allowed people to see it. People often say this established the borders of the states in the Middle East. It didn't. That is not true. But what it did do was establish the idea that Britain and France should control zones of influence. France in Syria and Lebanon, Britain in Iraq, northern Saudi Arabia, southern part of Palestine, and a kind of middle buffer zone which would contain Jerusalem, basically. So the principle being these colonial powers, without asking anyone, didn't go and ask the Palestinians or the Syrians or the Saudis, what do you think about us controlling your country? Because they'd probably have said, no, we don't want to do that. Divided it up between the two of them in principle, not in the actuality of the borders, but in principle. That was followed by, of course, or the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, which was between the Sharif Hussein, so the leader or the kind of monarch of Mecca and Medina, so the Muslim holy places, the leader of the Arab revolt. If you've seen Lawrence of Arabia, he's in that. So this kind of movement of tribes essentially to attack the Ottomans in the rear. As a reward or an encouragement for that, McMahon, who was the ruler of Egypt at the time, basically, or the British High Commissioner in Egypt, essentially promised this dynasty, so not people, but this monarch and his family, control of an Arab kingdom that would run from essentially the Sinai Peninsula to possibly the Gulf, ill-defined area, with some exceptions, it says in the text, west of Aleppo, whatever that means. So a kind of hazy promise. And then the final one, which is very well known, I think John will maybe speak a bit about, the man who came up with it, the Balfour Declaration. So the Balfour Declaration, and I shall look at the text because it's quite important, was made by the Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur Balfour, who incidentally was from Edinburgh, or from Haddington, and he was also the Chancellor of Edinburgh University for decades. The Balfour Declaration stated, His Majesty's government shall look with favour upon the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. Notice that they're not considered to have a national home. They are reduced to the status of communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I mean, why would they do this? It was a war. So this is the First World War is the context for this. As a strategic move, Britain or British policymakers thought that having this kind of colony, essentially, in the Middle East would make a statelet that would always be dependent on Britain. And this was expressed by Sir Ronald Storrs, who was the first governor of Jerusalem, so he was not a marginal figure, when he described the planned settlement as a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabs. Again, Winston Churchill, 1920, at the time of the San Remo negotiations, stated, "A Jewish state under the protection of the Crown would from every point of view be beneficial and would be especially in harmony with the truest interests of the British Empire." Chaim Weizmann, so the first president of Israel, really leading Zionist figure, states in his memoirs, "What we wanted was a protectorate. A Jewish Palestine would be a safeguard to England, in particular in respect to the Suez Canal." So it's important to understand that this is not being done out of some kind of notion of the welfare of the Jewish people. Balfour was quite anti-Semitic in that he had pushed forward legislation designed to stop Jewish immigration to Britain in 1905. And then you can look at what, in the very same article, Churchill has to say about why Britain should support a Jewish state or national homeland, where he says it would be a counterweight to the Russian Revolution and to Trotsky's schemes of worldwide communistic state under Jewish domination. So exactly these kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that flow around the world today, expressed by the people who are kind of putting this declaration out there. It's important to understand that, I think. This, of course, is then followed, and in contradiction to, the 14 points of President Wilson. So President Woodrow Wilson presented this idea of national self-determination in Europe, it should be stated, in Europe, as the reason why there had been conflict, or these multinational empires that had imprisoned their nationalities. This is an idea that's behind the foundation of the League of Nations, as part of which there was an establishment of the idea of mandates. So mandates were to take over by the victorious powers in the First World War the territories of the losers. They divided them up into several categories. Palestine was a Class A mandate, which meant it was supposedly more ready for self-government. The idea being that Britain is supposed to make the Palestinians able to govern themselves. Now, there's a big problem with this, which is the Palestinians were already governing themselves. They didn't need Britain to tell them how to do it. It's based on a deeply racist idea that was expressed by Balfour at the San Remo conference, which established the mandates and incorporated the Balfour Declaration into the Palestine mandates as part of the legal foundation. But he said in a private letter to Lord Curzon that we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants. Zionism is of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Again, echoed by Chaim Weizmann, at the same time said, and I apologize for the colonial language, but this is the original text, the British have told us that there are some hundreds of thousands of Negroes, but the matter is of no consequence. So this is the underlying world of thought that can make this kind of thing happen. And on the basis of the mandate, you could get the establishment of the Yishuv, or I should say the new Yishuv. So not the old Jewish community, Yishuv means community, which were indigenous and already living in Palestine, but the new Yishuv of settlement, which I think John touched on. Okay.
Could I just ask a quick question, Jamie? So you mentioned at the beginning that you consider the Palestinians to be the indigenous population to this land. How do you define indigenous?
They were living there. They're living there, it's obvious. I mean, if somebody was to come to, let's say that somebody was to go from Wales now and say to people living in London, well, we used to live here, you know. The Cumbric peoples were living here until whenever, 800 AD. You have to leave. It would be absurd. There's no point in even, I think, using this notion of ethnic ties to land. The Palestinians were simply the people who were living in Palestine when it was colonized. That's all we need to know.
John, do you share that same opinion?
I agree with every word there. What I don't know is whether there are any academic definitions of the word indigenous. It's not something I've looked into, but I think in terms of, you know, that is straightforward. One thing we've got to think of course, and I think you're going to call on me to talk about Zionism in a moment, aren't you? Well, maybe I should save it for then, but you know, the question is, in international law, there is no definition of what constitutes a people. There's a lot in international law about what a state is, but there is nothing about a people or a nation. And so when in an international legal text the word people appears, you can only tell what it means from the particular context in which it occurs. And if we're talking about the people of, shall we say, I don't want to get into controversies about this, but people between the Mediterranean Sea and the River Jordan, shall we just take that as a geographical unit? At the time of 1918, at the end of the First World War, at the time of the end of the Ottoman Empire, the people who were inhabiting that land is something that we could discuss what was meant. And I think an important point to mention here is that today we think very much of Islamism in various forms, moderate, extreme, and so on, when we think about the Arab world. But at that time, Arab nationalism was secular, militantly secular. The Jews who were indigenous to Palestine, and Jamie didn't say anything about this, and I don't know if you agree, but I suspect you do. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that there have always been Jews living in Palestine. You know, whatever happened in 78 AD did not get rid of the entire Jewish community there. There were Jews there. There was another revolt in AD 130, we know, and there's much evidence to show this, you know, archaeological evidence of synagogues and so on. But were they a separate people from the other people inhabiting Palestine, apart from the settlers who'd come to from Europe, who I'm going to be talking about in a minute? They were Arabic speaking, they were Arab in culture. And Jamie also mentioned the 1840 Damascus blood libel, and he mentioned that it was something that came from, was started by some Catholic missionaries. You said were Italian.
Sorry, I might have got that wrong.
Well, I think some of them were, I think there was also a French consul.
It was the French consul, Italian missionaries, I think.
Yeah, it was an Italian missionary who was murdered.
Yes, that's right.
But there was an anti-Semitic French consul in Damascus, and he is the guy who kicked it all off. Now, one of the shames, and I'm a Christian myself, but one of the shameful things in Christian history, of course, is Christian anti-Semitism towards the Jews. And the blood libel the idea that in some way Jews have a secret ritual in which they kill a Christian child to reenact the death of Jesus in some horribly perverted satanic ritual. That lie actually originated in medieval England, though it seems to be based on something taken from the Book of Josephus, but that's detail we needn't go into. But
if I could just come back to a previous point that you made, because you had said that might confuse some people. You had said that there were some Jews that were indigenous to the land, but then also that Palestinians were the indigenous people to that land. That may confuse a few people in the audience. So can you clarify?
Great. We're having a discussion under rules of freedom of speech. I don't care if people are confused. We can sort the confusion out by free and objective discussion. Okay? So please take me up on that if you want to at any point. But sorry, it's important that I finish that very long sentence I was saying, or my point you'll only have half my point and you'll get the wrong end of the stick. The point is that the blood libel is an exclusively Christian thing. And I'm sorry to say it has to be exclusively Christian, because it's only Christians who believe that Christ died on Calvary and rose from the dead. Muslims believe, and this is stated in the Quran, that Jesus was not crucified. Ergo, therefore, you cannot have a Muslim blood libel, because there would be no sense in Jews conducting such a ritual. Do you take my point? And that's a very important point, I think, for people to know. So the forms of Christian anti-Semitism, of European anti-Semitism. Can I now get on to Zionism?
One more questions for Jamie about the Ottoman Empire.
I also want to take Jamie up on one point, which I'd forgotten about.
Certainly, but I just wanted to say that your last question about people being confused about there being indigenous Jews in Palestine, that's only a problem if you think that there's a contradiction between being a Jew and being Palestinian, and there isn't.
Sure.
So, in fact, the other thing to remember is this category of national identity, which we're conflating with religious identity here, and we shouldn't, is recent. It didn't really exist at this time, and it didn't exist for Jews or Muslims, Christians, anyone. So there were lots of religious communities speaking the same language, basically, in this area, as there were across the Middle East. But there was no notion of a nationality that they could have. There were many people who came and went from the Holy Land, or whatever we want to call it, and they established, in some cases, religious communities. So there are a lot of Jewish rabbinical communities in kind of the holy cities, Hebron, Tiberias, Safad, as well as people who'd just always been there. So another thing to remember is there's another group of, so we can call it Israelite religion or a related religion to Judaism, the Samaritans, who've always lived in this area. They are, in fact, the descendants of the kingdom of, that's where the kingdom of Israel was. They are a Palestinian group. In fact, they have representation on the Palestinian National Council. So it's not a contradiction, basically.
So I want to ask you just a couple questions about the things you mentioned in the presentation. The first is, so in the 1834 Peasant Revolt, I think some people are going to be confused by the fact that it was against the Egyptians, considering we're talking about the Ottoman Empire here, the Turkish Empire. So can you explain that? And then also, can you explain the impact of the Peasant Revolt in 1834 on the shaping of the collective Palestinian national identity?
Yeah, sure. So at this time, in the 1830s, the Ottomans did not control Palestine, or let's call it the Levant. So Muhammad Ali he was actually Albanian. He was an Ottoman military officer who took over Egypt after it was invaded by France in 1800. You've seen the film Napoleon recently. He went to Egypt. And so Muhammad Ali tried to establish a kind of modernizing national state on the French model in Egypt, and then to take over bits of the Ottoman Empire until that made Britain and France too angry, basically, and they stopped it. So he was in control. Egypt was in control at this time. The local landowners and, it's kind of local elites, I suppose you would say, opposed Muhammad Ali, and they encouraged people to revolt, which went much further than they wanted it to go. But it's the beginning of, I wouldn't say necessarily a Palestinian national consciousness, but you begin to see a kind of reciprocal idea that these areas around of Syria, basically greater Syria, might need to do something like Muhammad Ali was doing in Egypt.
Okay. And then the second question I had was, so Palestinians are largely Arabs, correct?
Yeah, whatever that means. I mean, they speak Arabic. Arabic is the Palestinian national language.
The Ottomans was a Turkish empire.
No. So this again is this is a problem. So we live in a world where we think that there are things called nations, and we think these things are called nations because they speak languages that are particular to that nation. And then people go, well, you're in Scotland, you're speaking English, which points out that that doesn't always work. And that these nations must have states. This is incredibly new in human history, and it doesn't work for this time period. So it's important to avoid what I would say is like the Flintstones model of history, where you think that everyone in the past is exactly the same as us, and they went around in cars driven by dinosaurs. So this didn't have the notion of what an Arab meant. In fact, at this time, if you said Arab, it would mean a Bedouin. It would mean somebody who lives in the desert. People spoke Arabic. It's irrelevant what language they spoke. They cared about religious distinctions. So there were Muslims, there were Christians, there were Jews, and Muslim subsects, as well as other sects. So the idea that we have now of nationalism, where there's a language, Arabic, which imposes a national identity, Palestinian or otherwise, is new. And because Palestinians were reacting to colonization in the late 19th century, they were part of the Arab nationalist movement, which wanted to unify Arabic speakers without distinction of religion. So John mentioned they're generally secular. So Christians and Muslims together. So that's when you get the idea of Arab nationalism. To speak about now, yes, Arabic is the language that Palestinians generally speak. But there are also religious and linguistic minorities. There are people who, Syriac, for example, which we know as like Aramaic, language of Jesus, basically, is still used in some religious communities. Armenian, the equation of Palestinian, Arab, Muslim is not, it's not exact. It's not like that.
And what was the primary cause of that movement toward Arab nationalism toward the end of the Ottoman Empire?
Well, the idea of nationalism, first of all, hadn't existed before. So it came from the experience of seeing in Europe bits of the Ottoman Empire that began to establish independence in Europe. So Greece, for example, key one in around this time, 1820s, 1830s. It's notable, just talking about language. The Greeks of that time did not know that they were Greek. It was unfamiliar to them. They called themselves Rum, which meant Christians as opposed to the Muslims who were ruling them, who spoke Turkish, or well, they spoke the language that made the thing that we now call Turkish. There began to be a kind of domino effect in the Christian provinces of the Ottoman Empire, so Bulgaria, Romania, these other areas becoming split off, which inspired similar movements in the Arab world where people became aware of a linguistic rather than a religious difference. Especially after what was called the Young Turk Revolution, because this is happening amongst Turks as well. So the developing idea of Turkish kind of national consciousness to fight against or defend the empire against foreign powers, to adopt a national identity. So in 1908, there was a revolution, or a kind of, a revolution we can call it, led by army officers, mainly Turkish, Turkish speaking, actually. A lot of them were of other backgrounds. I mean, you cannot impose these categories on this time. It's the clear thing to remember. But as a result of that revolution, you began to get both more freedom in political organization and the idea of nationhood. So that is really the background.
Okay.
Yes. Could I just add a couple of things? At the very beginning, nationalism is something that develops and goes through several stages. No, the path to nationhood is not unique in every single case. They don't all go in exactly the same direction, but things gradually happen. And one of the very interesting and maybe tragic things about early Arab nationalism is it was very good at uniting Muslims and Christians. And Christians were a very substantial minority. They were 18% of Greater Syria, probably, something like 15% of Egypt, and so on, the Copts. But it's also very interesting, and I think this point should be made, is that there are one or two Jewish figures in the early Arab nationalist movements. Egyptian nationalism was then separate from Arab nationalism, but there was quite a key figure, I think, James Sanua, also known as Yaqub Sanua in his native Arabic, who was an Egyptian Jew and was one of the he played a very interesting role in Egypt in the 1870s and 80s and had to leave the country because he was going to be topped by the ruler, because the ruler did not like nationalist agitation of this sort. And one of the fascinating things about him is that he was an educated man, as you can imagine, but he managed to mix the language of the Quran with earthy Egyptian colloquial dialect in magazine articles and cartoons he published. He was actually the first cartoonist in an Arab country in the modern sense, which was used to stir up troops who were fighting to prevent a British invasion in 1882. So he's a very interesting figure. He died in 1912. But of course, once Zionism came on the scene, this became very difficult, because what Zionism did, but I'm not quite talking about Zionism yet, was it opened a huge gulf between all Jews ultimately, and everybody else who spoke Arabic. The other point I wanted to mention, you mentioned the Hussein McMahon correspondence, and you implied it wasn't clear. There is a very good book that only came out this year by a man called Peter Shambrook, called Policy of Deceit. And he has gone into he's actually spent a life's work dissecting the Sykes-Picot correspondence and how it was interpreted. And I think his book, which is published by One World Academic, shows pretty conclusively, I think it's now very hard to argue that Britain did not promise Palestine would be included in the Arab state.
What's the name of the book?
Policy of Deceit.
Policy of Deceit.